The capture of a cavalryman. September 14, 1914, near Soissons, France. French Lieutenant Jean-Pierre de la Horie watches his squadron disintegrate under German machine gun fire. Horses scream, men fall. The cavalry charge that should have swept the enemy from the field instead becomes a slaughter pen of mud and blood. His mount collapses beneath him, a bullet through its neck. De la Horie hits the ground hard, his saber flying from his grip. German infantry surrounds him within seconds, rifles leveled at his chest. He raises his hands. The war he imagined, one of glory and swift movement, ends in a French wheat field turned charnel house. He becomes prisoner number 2,847. The Germans march him and 60 other captured French officers eastward for 3 days. Their boots wear through, their uniforms, once immaculate, become encrusted with dried mud and sweat. Guards speak in harsh, clipped German, shoving stragglers with rifle butts. At Aachen, they load the prisoners into cattle cars. 80 men crammed into space meant for 40. The doors slam shut. Darkness. The stench of unwashed bodies fills the air within an hour. Someone vomits in the corner. The train lurches forward, heading deeper into Germany. De la Horie stands pressed against other men, unable to sit, unable to move. 3 days pass in that rolling coffin. When the doors finally open at a railway siding near Leipzig, 6 men have died standing upright, held in place by the compression of bodies. October 1914. O-Flag 4C materializes through morning fog like something from a nightmare. The camp sprawls across a hilltop, ringed by 2 parallel fences of barbed wire. Guard towers punctuate the perimeter at 50-meter intervals. German sentries with Mauser rifles watch from elevated positions. Beyond the wire, pine forests stretch toward distant mountains. The camp itself consists of long wooden barracks arranged in precise rows, typical Prussian efficiency applied to human caging. De la Horie and the other new arrivals shuffle through the main gate. A wooden sign reads Kriegsgefangenenlager in Gothic script, war prisoner camp. The guards process them with mechanical precision, names recorded, personal effects confiscated, uniforms exchanged for rough prison garb. Each man receives a tin cup, a wooden bowl, and a thin blanket that reeks of disinfectant and previous owners. But O-Flag 4C holds a secret the new prisoners cannot yet comprehend. The camp sits 15 kilometers from a munitions factory complex. The Kaiser's war machine demands shells, bullets, explosives. The factory demands labor. The guards divide the prisoners into work details within hours of arrival. Officers, protected by the Hague Convention from forced labor, find those protections mean nothing here. The German commandant, Oberst Klaus Reinhardt, makes this clear during the first assembly in the central yard. Geneva means nothing in wartime, he announces in accented French. You work or you starve. Those are your choices. Behind him, guards hold leashed German shepherds that strain toward the assembled prisoners. The dogs' barking echoes off the barracks walls. De la Horie stands in formation with 300 other French officers. He recognizes the man beside him. Captain Marcel Dubois from the 12th Dragoons. Dubois' face has aged a decade in 3 weeks. Sunken eyes, hollowed cheeks. The captain whispers without moving his lips. They're using us to build weapons, to kill our own countrymen. The realization settles over De la Horie like ice water. Every shell casing they produce, every bullet travels west to the front, to French trenches and soldiers. The Germans have created a perfect moral torture, refuse to work and die of starvation, work and become complicit in killing your brothers in arms. That first night, De la Horie lies on wooden slats in Barracks 7. The building houses 60 men in a space designed for 30. Bodies pack the sleeping platforms. Someone weeps quietly in the darkness. Another man prays in Breton. The smell overwhelms, a mixture of unwashed humanity, nearby latrine pits, and a chemical scent that burns the nostrils. A veteran prisoner, Major Henri Lavigne, 3 months into captivity, explains. The factory, you'll smell it every day. Gets into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. Some men cough blood after a month on the powder lines. De la Horie asks about escape. Lavigne laughs bitterly. See those towers? Guards shoot anyone within 5 meters of the wire. They killed 2 men last week for retrieving a ball that rolled too close. The forest looks promising until you realize German patrols with dogs sweep it daily. And even if you got past all that, you're 500 kilometers from France, surrounded by a nation at war, speaking no German, with your face on every police station wall. Dawn arrives at 0500 hours. Whistles shriek. Guards hammer on barracks doors. Appel. Appel. Roll call. The prisoners stumble into formation in the central yard. October frost coats the ground. Most men lack proper coats. They stand in thin prison uniforms, shivering as German guards count and recount, checking numbers against rosters. The process takes 90 minutes. 2 men have died during the night. Their bodies lie at the end of the formation, awaiting removal. No ceremony, no acknowledgement. Just numbers to be subtracted from the camp total. Breakfast consists of a ladle of thin gruel, more water than oats, and a crust of black bread so hard it must be soaked to chew. De la Horie forces it down. Around him, men eat with mechanical desperation, knowing this might be all they receive until evening. The work details form up. Guards separate prisoners by assignment, munitions factory, road construction, camp maintenance. De la Horie finds himself assigned to the shell casing workshop, a vast echoing building where lathes and presses turn raw brass into artillery components. The noise assaults immediately, metal screaming against metal, hammers pounding, machines clattering in rhythmic violence. The foreman, a German civilian named Kruger, demonstrates the work. Feed brass blanks into the lathe, shape the casing, remove and inspect. Repeat 12 hours daily. Guards with rifles patrol between the workstations. Quotas are absolute. Fail to meet production targets and lose food rations. No exceptions. De la Horie grips the lathe controls. His hands, trained for cavalry reins and saber grips, now manufacture death for his countrymen. The moral weight crushes him, but hunger proves stronger. He works. Around him, other French officers operate similar machines. No one speaks. The noise makes conversation impossible. At midday, they receive 15 minutes rest and a cup of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Men collapse against walls, hands blistered, arms trembling from repetitive motion. A prisoner named Laurent, once a cavalry captain like de la Horie, stares at his bleeding palms. "I'm becoming a factory worker," he mutters. "They're turning us into machines." Evening brings another appel. More counting, more standing in the cold. Dinner consists of watery soup, a potato, another crust of bread. The prisoners shuffle back to barracks as darkness falls. De la Horie's body screams with fatigue. His hands throb. His ears ring from the factory noise. But something else bothers him more. In the corner of the workshop, he noticed a door marked "Verboten," forbidden. Guards stationed there permanently. During his 12-hour shift, he observed 6 German civilian technicians enter and exit, all wearing special protective gear, thick gloves and cloth masks tied over their faces. Whatever lies behind that door requires protection the regular factory workers don't receive. Lavigne confirms his suspicion that night. Poison gas components, the major whispers. They're manufacturing chemical weapons, chlorine, phosgene. The masks you saw? Those men work with concentrated forms that burn exposed skin on contact. They keep that section separate because leaks have killed workers before. De la Horie feels the floor drop away. The Germans aren't just using prisoners to build conventional weapons. They're forcing them to create the new face of industrialized warfare, the gas that will choke men to death in trenches across the front. The moral calculus becomes impossible. Work equals complicity in atrocity. Refuse equals death by starvation. 3 weeks pass. De la Hourie's body adapts to the brutal routine. Wake, appel, factory, appel, sleep. His hands develop calluses. His mind grows numb. Around him, men break in different ways. Some work with mechanical efficiency, emotions shut down completely. Others sabotage when possible, producing defective casings that slip past inspection, knowing those faulty shells might misfire and kill German artillerymen. The guards catch saboteurs eventually. Punishment is public and brutal. 10 lashes in the central yard. De la Hourrie watches a lieutenant from Marseille receive his flogging for deliberately damaging a lathe. The man's screams echo off the barracks. Afterward, guards drag him to the isolation cells, concrete boxes barely large enough to stand in, where prisoners exist on bread and water for weeks. But De la Hourrie notices something during those weeks of grinding routine. The guards follow patterns. The tower sentries rotate every 4 hours. During rotation, a 60-second gap exists when the new guard climbs the ladder and the old guard descends. The perimeter patrols with dogs sweep clockwise, taking 40 minutes to circle the entire camp. And that forbidden door in the factory? The technicians emerge at 1400 hours daily for a smoking break, leaving it unguarded for 12 minutes. Information collects in his mind like intelligence briefings before a cavalry raid. Escape might be impossible, but his cavalry doctrine remained. Understand the enemy's patterns, find the weakness, exploit the gap. December brings snow and darker horrors. The factory increases production quotas. 12-hour shifts extend to 14, then 16. Men collapse at their stations. A prisoner named Rousseau dies when his arm gets caught in a lathe, tearing it off at the shoulder. He bleeds out on the factory floor while the other prisoners continue working. The guards don't stop production for corpse removal. 2 more prisoners die from chemical exposure when a gas cylinder leaks in the forbidden section. Their bodies emerge on stretchers, faces purple and swollen. The camp doctor, Dr. Friedrich Brenner, examines them briefly, then orders immediate burial. No investigation, no safety review, just 2 more numbers subtracted from the roster. De la Hourrie realizes the Germans intend to work them to death. Oflag 4C isn't a prison camp. It's a death factory with a slower mechanism than bullets but equal efficiency. The calculation becomes clear. Within 6 months, half the men would die from disease, starvation, industrial accidents, or chemical exposure. The survivors work until they too collapse. Fresh prisoners arrive to replace the dead. The system perpetuates itself with Prussian precision. Escape stops being about glory or duty. It becomes pure survival mathematics. Stay and die certainly. Attempt escape and probably die, but probably beat certainly. On December 23, 1914, De la Hourrie watches Dr. Brenner enter the factory to examine a prisoner suffering from chemical burns. The doctor wears a white coat marked with the Red Cross insignia. He carries a medical bag. Guards snap to attention as he passes, offering respectful nods. Medical personnel occupy a strange middle ground, even in wartime. Respected, trusted, allowed access. An idea begins forming in De la Hourrie's mind, dangerous and desperate. But that night, before he can fully develop the plan, something extraordinary happens. A prisoner in his barracks, a former teacher named Christophe Moreau, begins screaming. Not pain, not terror, madness. Moreau tears at his uniform, shouting about invisible insects covering his skin. He claws his arms bloody. 3 men restrain him while others run for guards. They drag Moreau to the camp medical facility. The next morning, word spreads. Moreau has gone completely insane, raving and incoherent. Dr. Brenner declares him mentally unfit and transfers him to a psychiatric facility in Berlin. Moreau has escaped the death factory, not through cunning or courage, through madness. De la Hourrie lies on his wooden slat that night, mind racing. The pieces connect, the patterns, the gaps, the opportunity. And now, a method nobody would suspect. His cavalryman's mind, trained for swift tactical thinking, begins constructing a plan so audacious it borders on insanity itself. But in OFLAG 4C, where sanity means accepting death by degrees, perhaps madness offers the only rational escape. Chapter 2. The Hell of Monotony. Life in the OFLAG was not one of overt physical brutality, but a slow psychological hell. The days bled into one another, a bleak routine of roll calls, meager rations, and endless boredom, all watched over by impassive German guards. For a man of action like de la Horie, this enforced idleness was a form of torture. He watched as the optimism of his fellow officers corroded into despair. Escape attempts, born of desperation, were common but futile. The camp was well guarded, and punishments for failure were severe. He saw men risk their lives tunneling, only to be discovered and thrown into solitary confinement. De la Horie realized physical escape was a fool's errand. The Germans expected it. He needed a weapon they couldn't confiscate, his own mind. The first morning established the pattern of his captivity. At 5:30, before dawn, the shrill whistle cut through the barracks. De la Horie jerked awake on the wooden boards that served as his bed, the thin blanket offering no warmth against the February cold. Around him, 30 other French officers stirred, coughing in the dank air. The barracks smelled of unwashed bodies, mildew, and the acrid smoke from the single stove that never provided enough heat. They filed out into the Appellplatz, the parade ground, where frost glittered on the packed dirt. The formation was precise, demanded with Germanic efficiency. Guards counted heads, recounted, consulted lists. De la Horie stood in the second row, hands at his sides, breathing vapor into the pre-dawn darkness. The commandant, Hauptmann Richter, walked the lines with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching on frozen ground. When he stopped in front of Lieutenant Moreau, a pilot from Bordeaux who had arrived the week before, de la Horie saw what was coming. Moreau's buttons were misaligned, a minor infraction. Richter struck him across the face with his gloves, a controlled motion that snapped the young officer's head sideways. No one moved, no one spoke. Moreau straightened, blood trickling from his split lip, eyes fixed on the middle distance. The message was clear. The Germans controlled every detail of their existence. The roll call lasted 47 minutes that morning. It would last 47 minutes every morning, regardless of weather or sickness. Breakfast was distributed at 7, a tin cup of ersatz coffee from roasted acorns, black bread that had more sawdust than grain, a scraping of margarine that tasted of chemicals. De la Horie ate slowly, making it last, though his stomach cramped with hunger. Before the war, he had been a robust man, 175 pounds of muscle. The camp scales during the first medical inspection showed 148 pounds. 3 weeks of captivity had stripped 27 pounds from his frame. The work detail began at 8. The Germans were expanding the camp, adding new barracks for the flood of Allied prisoners from the Wehrmacht's spring offensive. De la Horie and 20 other officers were marched to the construction site on the eastern perimeter, inside the wire but visible from the guard towers. They mixed concrete by hand, the lime burning their skin, their breath fogging in the cold air. The guards watched from a distance, rifles across their chests, bored but vigilant. Capitaine Arnaud, a career officer who had spent 6 months in the OFLAG before de la Horie's arrival, worked beside him. Arnaud moved with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy. He showed de la Horie how to minimize strain, look productive while doing less, and steal rest when the guards looked away. "The first month you try to resist," Arnaud said quietly, his voice barely audible over the scrape of shovels. "You think you can maintain who you were. By the second month you understand that man is gone. You become someone new, someone smaller, or you break." De la Horie watched Arnaud's hands, cracked and bleeding from the lime, and understood. This was a war of attrition against the self. By the third week, de la Horie could identify each guard by their walk and temperament. Hauptmann Richter ran the camp with obsessive order, arriving at his office at precisely 7:45 each morning, departing at 1700 hours unless there was an incident. Unteroffizier Müller, who supervised the work details, was lazy, often wandering away to smoke, leaving supervision to younger guards. Gefreiter Klaus, barely 20, was nervous, his rifle always moving, his eyes darting. He had shot a Russian prisoner the previous month for stepping out of formation. The bullet was unnecessary. The Russian had been reaching for his fallen cap. Klaus was dangerous because he was afraid. The prisoner hierarchy emerged through observation. Lieutenant Colonel Devereux, the senior French officer, maintained military discipline, insisting on salutes, proper forms of address, and the fiction that they were still soldiers, not captives. Some officers embraced this structure, finding comfort in routine. Others resented it, seeing it as collaboration with their own imprisonment. De la Horie noticed Sous-Lieutenant Beaumont, a navigator who had flown reconnaissance missions over the Ruhr. Beaumont kept a small notebook hidden in his mattress, sketching the camp layout, marking guard positions and timing patrols. Every third night, he added new observations. He shared nothing, trusted no one, working alone on plans that would likely fail. De la Horie recognized the obsession because he felt it building in himself. After 6 weeks, the first death occurred. Commandant Tessier, a reservist from Lyon, developed pneumonia. The camp hospital, a converted storage room with minimal supplies, could do nothing. The German doctor, a Wehrmacht surgeon named Steiner, who visited twice weekly, prescribed rest and fluids. Tessier died on a Thursday morning, drowning in his own lungs while other sick prisoners listened. His body was removed before lunch. Roll call that evening was 4 minutes longer while the Germans verified their count. The next morning, someone else took Tessier's place in formation, and the routine continued unchanged. De la Horie stopped counting days after Tessier's death. Counting implied a future beyond the wire. Instead, he began counting other things. Guard rotations changed every 8 hours. The northeast tower had a blind spot near the latrine block, visible for 37 seconds during the shift change at 1400 hours. The supply truck arrived every Tuesday and Friday at 10:15, staying for 40 minutes. The driver, Corporal Schmidt, smoked 3 cigarettes before departing. The prisoners developed their own economy of survival. Cigarettes became currency, traded for favors, information, and the small comforts that made captivity bearable. A non-smoker, De la Horie saved his Red Cross rations, trading them to Sergeant Olivier, a quartermaster with connections to the camp kitchen staff. In exchange, Olivier provided an extra portion of watery but hot soup twice a week, keeping starvation at a greater distance. By the 3rd month, De la Horie recognized the patterns of breaking. Lieutenant Dupont stopped washing and speaking, sitting in the barracks staring at nothing. The Germans took him away one morning. No one asked where. Capitaine Bernard became obsessed with an invented woman, writing love letters to someone he called Marguerite on scraps of paper he hid throughout the barracks. There had never been a Marguerite. Bernard's mind had created her to survive. De la Horie felt his own mind shifting, adapting. He recited mathematical formulas during roll call, working complex equations in his head to keep his thoughts sharp. He visualized flight paths during work details, replaying missions, calculating headings and fuel consumption with obsessive precision. The Germans could confine his body, but his mind remained free, a freedom he guarded with desperate intensity. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late May. The supply truck arrived as scheduled, but this delivery included something unusual, a stack of German newspapers, weeks old, for the guards' recreation room. As the truck was unloaded, one paper slipped from the stack, falling near the work detail. De la Horie watched it tumble across the dirt, saw Gefreiter Klaus retrieve it, and watched him glance at the front page before tucking it under his arm. But in those 3 seconds, De la Horie saw the headline, Luftwaffe Heroes Decorated for Service. Beneath it was a photograph of German pilots beside their aircraft, smiling, celebrating victories in skies he knew intimately. The observation sparked something. Klaus had looked at that newspaper with indifference, the casual disregard of someone who saw it as routine propaganda. To Klaus, it was just paper, but to De La Horie, it revealed a crucial truth. The Germans' confidence in their control made them careless with information. That night, as rain hammered the barracks roof, De La Horie considered what he had learned. Physical escape was nearly impossible. The Germans expected tunnels. They had systems to detect them. The wire could not be cut without triggering alarms. The gates were too heavily guarded. Conventional escape was a fool's game. But what if escape did not mean going over the wire? What if it meant making the Germans believe you were not worth keeping? What if you could convince them to open the gates themselves? He thought of the newspaper, Klaus's indifference, and how the guards saw prisoners as defeated, broken, harmless. He thought of Capitaine Bernard and his invented Marguerite, of Lieutenant Dupont staring at nothing, of how the Germans had simply removed them when they became problems. He thought of the one thing the Germans could not guard against, a prisoner who convinced them he had lost his mind completely, not vacant like Dupont or retreating into harmless fantasy like Bernard, but becoming dangerously, convincingly insane in a way that would force the Germans to transfer him out of the Oflag to a medical facility with different security, different guards, different possibilities. It was not yet a plan, only its seed, growing in the darkness as rain fell. But for the first time since arriving, De La Horie felt something other than despair. He felt possibility. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. De La Horie observed a crucial loophole in the prison system. While able-bodied officers were warehoused indefinitely, those deemed medically unfit, particularly the mentally broken, were sometimes repatriated through neutral countries like Switzerland. This wasn't kindness, but German pragmatism. A mad officer was a drain on resources with no military value. This observation sparked a revolutionary idea. If he couldn't break out of the camp, he would get himself thrown out. The breaking point wasn't hysteria, but ice-cold logic. He would feign insanity, delivering a performance so profound and unwavering it would convince the famously methodical German doctors. The cost would be his dignity, his friendships, and his own sense of self. The decision crystallized during evening roll call as he watched Captain Moreau being dragged to solitary. Caught digging a tunnel, Moreau was beaten unconscious, his blood a stark trail on the frozen yard. He was the third tunneler caught this month, all now facing extended isolation, reduced rations, or execution. Traditional escape methods led only to death or deeper captivity. The walls were too high, the wire too extensive, the guards too numerous. But the bureaucratic escape hatch for the genuinely broken remained open. His mind began working with military precision. The German medical system operated on documented observation, and its Wehrmacht physicians prided themselves on scientific rigor. They wouldn't be fooled by simple theatrics. He recalled the repatriated cases. All shared sustained behavioral changes, complete dissociation from military bearing, physical manifestations of mental collapse, and an inability to maintain social norms. The madness had to be total, consistent, and progressive. Half measures would mean punishment, not repatriation. After roll call, walking among officers who knew him as a disciplined, sane presence, he understood they must all believe he had broken. He couldn't confide in anyone. A single whispered word risked exposure to informants or well-meaning comrades who might try to help and reveal the strategy. He catalogued his knowledge of German psychiatric protocols. The camp maintained detailed medical records, with doctors conducting regular inspections. The mentally ill were separated into special barracks under increased supervision, a supervision that paradoxically created the pathway out. If an officer's condition worsened and he became unmanageable, the bureaucracy initiated transfer paperwork, first to a psychiatric facility in Germany, then potentially to repatriation. The performance had to begin immediately and escalate gradually. Too sudden, and it would trigger suspicion. Too slow, and he risked genuine psychological damage or the war ending before his escape. He estimated 3 to 4 months for the full transformation, enough time to establish credible progression without the sustained act destroying his sanity. That night, de la Horie made his first move. Lying on his bunk, he began muttering, stringing together nonsensical phrases of French military terms and childhood memories. His neighbor, Lieutenant Beaumont, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The next morning, he observed his audience with renewed purpose. Hauptmann Weber, the senior medical officer, was methodical, humorless, and thorough. He was the one to convince. De la Horie mapped the progression. Stage 1, a subtle deterioration in military bearing and personal discipline. Stage 2, social withdrawal and conversations with invisible presences. Stage 3, aggressive episodes requiring intervention, triggering formal medical evaluations. He began participating differently in the camp routine. During formation, he stood slightly out of alignment, staring at nothing, responding a half-second late to commands. He forced himself to eat messily, spilling soup on his uniform, a violation of his every instinct. When fellow officers approached with concern, he offered disconnected statements. "The snow is deep this year. My mother made excellent bread." Concerned faces withdrew. The isolation began. The barracks guard, Gefreiter Schultz, noted the changes in his daily reports. De la Horie watched him write, observing the frequency of his notations increase. The documentation was building. Within 2 weeks, the muttering was constant. He spoke to unseen entities, responded to unasked questions, and let out high-pitched, contextless laughs during the tedium of roll call. Other prisoners distanced themselves from him, a necessary step in becoming the isolated madman. The physical manifestations escalated. He stopped bathing and maintaining his uniform, letting his hair grow wild until the stench became notable. Fellow officers complained to the guards, reinforcing the narrative of complete breakdown to the order-obsessed Germans. The camp commandant ordered increased observation. De la Horie started refusing food, then demanding it erratically, even eating from others' bowls until restrained. Each incident was recorded, each outburst adding weight to the file. German efficiency was building his case. The hardest moments arrived when he encountered men who knew him well. Captain Renard, who served with him before capture, attempted an intervention. "Henri, what has happened to you? This is not you. Fight this." De la Horie stared through him before reciting numbers backward at a shout, skipping random intervals. Renard backed away, defeated and disturbed. Another friendship was sacrificed on the altar of escape. At night, alone with his thoughts, de la Horie desperately fought to maintain the boundary between performance and reality, silently reciting his true identity, his mission. But the line blurred daily. The act was becoming habit. He caught himself muttering when no one was watching, responding to his own imagined voices. He clung to sanity in the few private hours he had. The critical test arrived 5 weeks in. Hauptmann Weber conducted a formal psychiatric evaluation in the camp infirmary. 4 guards stood by as Weber, who spoke adequate French, began asking standard questions to test orientation and cognition. De la Horie provided answers that were almost correct but subtly wrong. The year was off by 2, the season confused, his rank fluctuated between lieutenant and general. He identified Weber as his brother, his commanding officer, and a priest. The confusion was consistent, not random enough to seem faked, but too incoherent for sanity. Weber took extensive notes, his expression unreadable behind steel-rimmed spectacles. The examination included physical tests of reflexes and coordination. De la Horie let his movements be jerky and uncontrolled. When Weber shone a light in his eyes, he recoiled and began weeping, then laughing, then striking himself until guards restrained him. The violence was calculated to appear genuine, lacking any pattern of conscious control. After 90 minutes, Weber concluded the examination. His notation read, "Progressive Wahnsinn, Beobachtung fortsetzen, progressive insanity, continue observation." De la Horie was transferred to the psychiatric observation barracks, a separate building housing 17 other mentally broken Allied officers. The conditions were less crowded, but observation was constant. His performance could not lapse for a moment. He was now living among genuine madness. A British major set a table for his invisible family each evening. A French captain endlessly relived his capture. A Polish lieutenant rocked in total silence. De la Horie had to convince the doctors he belonged among these shattered men, while maintaining the internal coherence to see his escape through. The performance intensified. He refused to sleep, pacing and shouting at phantoms. He fought with manic strength when guards tried restraining him, requiring 3 men to control him. Each incident was documented, each weekly evaluation with Weber charting a steady descent. 3 months into the performance, he barely recognized his reflection. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild, his hair and beard unkempt. The uniform hung on his skeletal frame. He had lost nearly 20 pounds, a real physical deterioration driven by the act. He was sacrificing his health and risking his actual sanity to appear useless to the Germans. The final evaluation arrived in the 4th month. Weber brought Oberstaatsdoktor Dr. Kessler, a senior psychiatric consultant from Berlin, to review severe cases for repatriation. Kessler was the ultimate authority. This was the moment everything had built toward. De la Horie sat before them, a shell of the officer he had been. When Kessler asked him to identify himself, he whispered that his name was many things, that he was already dead, that the doctors were angels sent to collect him. Kessler tested his responses to stimuli and simple instructions. Every response was carefully calibrated to show complete dissociation from reality, consistent with documented psychiatric conditions, not malingering. Kessler conferred with Weber in Low German, discussing whether the condition was organic or stress-induced, a medical burden, or a case with potential for recovery. De la Horie maintained his vacant stare, rocking and muttering about snow and bread. The decision was made. Kessler signed the transfer documentation. De la Horie was approved for repatriation through Switzerland within 6 weeks. Pending coordination with the International Red Cross, he had successfully convinced the German medical system that Lieutenant Henri de la Horie no longer existed, replaced by a hopeless lunatic. The performance had succeeded, but as guards escorted him back to the observation barracks, he realized the most dangerous phase still lay ahead. He had to maintain the act through the transfer, through Swiss medical evaluations, and all the way back to France. Any slip, any moment of revealed competence would mean execution as a spy. The madman had to remain mad until he crossed into Allied territory. With each passing day, the line between performance and reality grew thinner. He had broken himself to escape captivity. The question was whether enough of him remained to complete the journey home. Chapter 4. The Performance of a Lifetime. De la Horie's plan was bizarre and brilliant. He adopted the persona of a human weathercock. For months he would stand for hours in the prison yard, one arm rigidly outstretched, pointing in a fixed direction, completely unresponsive to his surroundings. He remained motionless in rain, snow, or searing sun. He ceased speaking incoherent sentences, communicating only with a strange bird-like coo-ee sound. His personal hygiene dissolved entirely. Fellow prisoners watched in alarm as he began eating spiders, flowers from the camp garden, and other inedible objects. He never broke character, not once. When guards prodded him or doctors questioned him, he would simply stare through them or make his nonsensical call. The performance was so total that even his own countrymen began to believe he had genuinely lost his mind, shunning him as the camp madman. This isolation was a critical part of his plan, proving his condition was real. The scheme demanded absolute commitment. De la Horie knew that German military psychiatrists were trained observers, experts in detecting malingering among prisoners desperate to escape combat duty or imprisonment. Half measures would be spotted immediately. A prisoner who acted insane only during medical examinations but was normal among his fellows would be dismissed as a fraud and likely sent to punishment cells. The deception required living the madness 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for however long it took, months, perhaps a year. De la Horie accepted this grim calculation. The alternative was remaining in German captivity for the duration of the war, growing weaker each month, risking execution if the tide turned against Germany, or dying from disease in the overcrowded camp. Madness offered the only viable exit path. The physical toll began within days. Standing motionless for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch sent waves of excruciating pain through his legs. His shoulder joints screamed from holding his arm extended in the weathercock position. Winter brought freezing rain that soaked through his thin uniform and turned his fingers blue. He did not move. Snow accumulated on his outstretched arm and on his head, and still he remained a statue. Guards laughed, threw snowballs at him, kicked at his legs to test his resolve. He stared through them with vacant eyes. When his body finally collapsed from exhaustion, he would be dragged back to the barracks by annoyed fellow prisoners who had begun viewing him as a liability rather than a comrade. Inside the barracks, the performance continued without pause. De la Horie stopped washing. He urinated on himself occasionally, allowing the stench to permeate his sleeping area, driving others away. He ate the inedible not just for show, but systematically, selecting items that would cause visible distress without killing him. Spiders disappeared into his mouth while other prisoners recoiled in horror. He plucked flowers from the small camp garden, ignoring the shouts of guards, and consumed petals and stems with apparent pleasure. Once he grabbed a handful of dirt and swallowed it, the grit grinding loudly between his teeth. The camp doctor was called. De la Horie simply made his bird call and pointed at nothing. His fellow French prisoners watched this deterioration with growing horror and disgust. In the brutal hierarchy of POW camps, where survival often depended on group cooperation and shared resources, a madman represented a profound danger. He could not be trusted to maintain silence during whispered discussions of war news. He could not contribute to work details or share in smuggled food. He might draw additional German scrutiny to the entire French contingent. Within 3 weeks, de la Horie found himself completely isolated. Men who had served alongside him, who had shared the trauma of capture and the misery of imprisonment, now avoided him entirely. They moved their bedding away from his sleeping space. They stopped speaking when he approached. When he made his bird call in the night, angry voices shouted for silence. This social death cut deeper than any physical pain, but it was precisely what de la Horie needed. The guards were watching, always watching, and the contempt shown by his own countrymen served as the most convincing proof that his madness was genuine. The German medical staff began their formal evaluation in the 2nd month. A doctor arrived at morning roll call and observed de la Horie standing in his weathercock position, arm extended towards the eastern fence, his eyes fixed on infinity. The doctor circled him, noting details in a small leather journal. He spoke to de la Horie in French, then German, then English. The only response was the hollow bird call. The doctor produced a pin and jabbed it into de la Horie's extended arm. A flicker of pain crossed the prisoner's face, an involuntary twitch, but he did not move, did not lower his arm, and did not acknowledge the test in any way. The doctor made more notes and departed. The psychological examinations intensified. German psychiatrists understood that prisoners would attempt to fake mental illness, and they had developed extensive tests to expose pretenders. De la Horie was brought to the camp medical office, a drafty wooden building that smelled of carbolic acid and tobacco. The psychiatrist, an older man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an impeccable uniform, watched as guards forced De la Horie into a chair. The questioning began in French, questions about his name, his unit, his family, his life before the war. De la Horie stared blankly at the wall. The doctor raised his voice, repeating questions with increasing volume and urgency. De la Horie made his bird call once, then resumed silence. The psychiatrist produced a photograph of a woman and children, claiming they were De la Horie's family begging for his return. De la Horie showed no recognition. The psychiatrist slammed his hand on the desk in frustration. Nothing. After 90 minutes, the examination ended. De la Horie was led back to the yard, where he immediately resumed his weathercock stance. The near disaster came 3 months into the performance. A new German officer arrived to take command of the camp, a Prussian major with a reputation for both efficiency and brutality. He conducted a thorough inspection of all camp facilities and procedures, including the medical cases. When he learned of De la Horie, the mad French weathercock, he demanded a definitive determination of authenticity. The major suspected malingering and wanted it exposed. He ordered De la Horie subjected to a more aggressive examination, one designed to break through any pretense. The test came without warning. De la Horie stood in his usual position in the yard, arm extended, mind floating in the half-aware state he had learned to maintain for hours. Guards approached from behind and seized him. They dragged him across the compound to the medical building where the new major waited alongside the camp psychiatrist. Inside the examination room, De la Horie was stripped naked and subjected to a comprehensive physical inspection. The doctors noted his deteriorating condition, the muscle atrophy from immobility, the skin infections from poor hygiene, the malnutrition evident in every protruding rib. Then the major ordered the critical test. They brought in heated implements, threatening burn torture if De la Horie did not drop his act. The major himself held a metal rod that had been heated over a lamp. He brought it close to De la Horie's bare skin, close enough that the radiating heat caused an instinctive flinch. The major watched De la Horie's eyes, searching for the moment of breaking, the instant when self-preservation would override pretense. De la Horie felt absolute terror. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat broke across his body despite the cold room. Every survival instinct screamed to speak, to beg, to confess the deception and accept punishment rather than burning. The heated metal touched his shoulder. Pain erupted. His flesh seared. The smell of his own burning skin filled his nostrils. De la Horie made his bird call, high and strange, cooey. He stared through the major as though the man did not exist. The psychiatrist placed a hand on the major's arm, speaking rapidly in German. De la Horie understood enough to know the doctor was arguing that a true malingerer would have broken, that the response to genuine pain revealed authentic mental dissociation. The major held the rod against De la Horie's skin for 3 more seconds, an eternity of agony, then pulled it away with a noise of disgust. He spat an order and left the room. The examination was over. De la Horie had passed, but the burn on his shoulder would scar permanently, a brand marking the price of his performance. The incident changed the German assessment. Within a week, De la Horie noticed subtle shifts. Guards stopped taunting him, treating him instead with the uneasy distance reserved for the genuinely insane. Medical orderlies began appearing regularly to observe him, taking notes but no longer attempting to provoke responses. The camp psychiatrist submitted his formal report. The French prisoner exhibited severe psychological trauma consistent with combat-induced psychosis, demonstrated catatonic behaviors, and showed no response to standard therapeutic interventions or disciplinary measures. The final recommendation was clear: transfer to a psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. This was the goal, the entire purpose of months of suffering. Mental institutions meant weaker security than military POW camps. Psychiatric patients were not treated as high-priority escape risks. They were warehoused, often in facilities located closer to neutral borders or in less secure regions of Germany. A transfer would place de la Horie in an environment where escape became possible, where the rigid security of the POW system no longer applied. He continued his performance, waiting for the bureaucratic machinery of the German military medical system to process his case. 5 months after beginning his weathercock routine, official word arrived. De la Horie was to be transferred to a psychiatric hospital in northern Germany, a facility that housed both military and civilian patients deemed mentally unfit. The transfer would occur within 2 weeks. Fellow French prisoners, those who still believed he was genuinely mad, watched as he was led away to prepare for transport. None said goodbye. He had ceased to exist as a person to them, reduced to the shambling madman who had disrupted their barracks and embarrassed their contingent. The final days in the POW camp tested de la Horie's resolve more than the preceding months. He knew the transfer was coming, knew his performance had succeeded, but could not celebrate or relax his guard for a moment. German efficiency demanded continued observation until the actual moment of departure. Any slip, any sign of normalcy would cancel the transfer and likely result in immediate punishment once the deception was revealed. He maintained his weathercock stance in the yard during daylight hours. He made his bird calls when spoken to. He ate a beetle that crawled across the barracks floor, forcing it down while nausea rose in his throat. The morning of transfer arrived with heavy fog. De la Horie was led from the barracks by 2 guards who treated him with careful distance, as though madness might be contagious. He was placed in the back of a covered truck alongside 2 other psychiatric transfers, both genuine cases, men whose minds had actually shattered under the pressure of war and captivity. The truck lurched forward. The POW camp disappeared behind them. De la Horie sat motionless, arm raised in his weathercock position despite the cramped space, eyes vacant as the vehicle carried him toward the next stage. The guards never suspected that behind the empty stare, a sharp mind was already analyzing the new environment, looking for a weakness, planning the next move, and counting the hours until he could become himself again and run. Chapter 5. The Medical Inquisition. The German camp authorities were initially suspicious. Malingering was a known tactic. They put de la Horie under intense surveillance, hoping to catch him in a moment of sanity. Camp doctors, including psychiatrists, subjected him to a battery of tests. They tried trick questions, sudden shocks, and offers of rewards for a rational response. One doctor shone a bright light directly into his eyes for an extended period. De la Horie didn't even flinch. For 18 months he maintained the facade. The German records meticulously documented his bizarre behavior. Stands for 6 hours facing north, consumed a bouquet of daisies, responds only to bird calls. The duration and consistency of his madness began to wear down their skepticism. No sane man, they reasoned, could possibly keep up such a demanding and humiliating charade for so long. Their professional certainty began to crumble against his unbreakable will. The medical examinations became increasingly invasive. Dr. Heinrich Weber, the senior camp psychiatrist, personally oversaw de la Horie's case. Weber had trained at the University of Vienna before the war and prided himself on his ability to detect malingerers, having exposed dozens of prisoners attempting to fake illness or insanity. De la Horie represented a professional challenge that bordered on obsession. Weber ordered de la Horie brought to the camp infirmary every 3rd day for systematic evaluations that lasted hours. He would arrive at unpredictable times, hoping to catch de la Horie unprepared. He entered the isolation cell at 3 in the morning with guards carrying lanterns. De la Horie sat motionless in the corner, humming a tuneless melody, eyes fixed on a crack in the ceiling. Weber clapped his hands inches from De La Hourie's face. Nothing. He shouted commands in French, then German, then English. De La Hourie continued humming, seemingly unaware of the doctor's presence. The guards shifted uncomfortably. They had seen men break under far less pressure, but this Frenchman seemed genuinely disconnected from reality. Orderlies placed a full meal on the floor near De La Hourie. Real food, not the watery soup and stale bread the prisoners normally received. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, even a small chocolate bar. De La Hourie ignored it completely. After 6 hours, the food remained untouched. A rat emerged from the shadows and began gnawing at the chicken. De La Hourie watched the rat with apparent fascination. Reaching out slowly to touch its tail, the rat scurried away. De La Hourie's hand remained extended, fingers moving, as if still petting the creature. Weber made careful notes. He returned the next day with De La Hourie's service record, photographs of his family, and letters from home. He spread them on the floor in front of the Frenchman and watched for any flicker of recognition. De La Hourie picked up a photograph of his mother and began tearing it methodically into tiny pieces, arranging the fragments in a spiral pattern on the concrete floor. His expression never changed. Weber felt his professional confidence waver for the first time. No man would destroy a photograph of his mother unless genuinely insane or possessed of inhuman self-control. The physical examinations proved equally inconclusive. Camp doctors checked De La Hourie's reflexes, searching for inconsistencies that would betray conscious control. When they tapped his knee, his leg would jerk unpredictably, sometimes not at all, sometimes in exaggerated spasms. A neurologist brought in from Berlin spent an entire day testing De La Hourie's responses to various stimuli. He pricked De La Hourie's arms with pins. Sometimes De La Hourie screamed as if severely burned. Other times he showed no reaction to deep punctures that drew blood. The neurologist couldn't find a pattern. He concluded that De La Hourie either suffered from genuine neurological damage or had somehow trained himself to override normal physiological responses. The neurologist returned to Berlin shaking his head, telling Weber that in 30 years of practice he had never encountered a case so baffling. Weber escalated his methods, ordering De La Hourie subjected to temperature extremes. Guards stripped him naked and left him in an unheated cell during winter nights when temperatures dropped below freezing. De La Hourie sat perfectly still, apparently unaware of the cold, even as his lips turned blue and his body shook with violent tremors. The guards watching through the observation slot grew concerned he might actually freeze to death. They reported his condition to Weber, who reluctantly ordered him returned to the regular cell. The next week, Weber tried heat. De La Hourie was confined to a small metal shed in direct summer sunlight, where the temperature exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. After 4 hours, De La Hourie remained seated in the center of the shed, sweat pouring down his face, still humming that same tuneless melody. He appeared completely unbothered by conditions that left the guards monitoring him dizzy and nauseous. His reports to the camp commandant, Oberstleutnant Klaus Fischer, grew lengthy and inconclusive, offering no definitive answer to Fischer's demands. Was the prisoner insane or not? The camp's medical staff discussed De La Hourie's case endlessly. Some believed he was genuinely mad, driven to a complete psychological break by the trauma of capture. Others remained convinced he was a malingerer of extraordinary discipline. A young medical officer, Lieutenant Schneider, proposed an ingenious test: stage a mock execution. Many prisoners who faked insanity would break when confronted with imminent death, their survival instinct overriding their deception. Weber approved the plan. One morning, guards dragged De La Hourie from his cell to the exercise yard, where a firing squad stood ready. The commandant read charges of attempted escape and resistance. De La Hourie was positioned against the wall. He did not resist or plead. He began collecting small stones from the ground and arranging them in a line, ignoring the soldiers with rifles pointed at his chest. The squad commander shouted the order to ready weapons. De la Horie looked up, smiled vacantly, and returned to his stones. The commander ordered his men to aim. De la Horie started singing a French nursery rhyme, off-key and with invented words. The commander hesitated, looking toward Weber, who observed from 20 meters away. Weber signaled to proceed. The commander shouted, "Fire!" The rifles cracked, but they were loaded with blanks. De la Horie fell backward, still singing, landing hard on the packed earth. He lay still for 5 seconds, then sat up slowly and resumed gathering stones as if nothing had happened. The soldiers looked at each other in disbelief. Several crossed themselves. Weber felt genuine unease for the first time and ordered De la Horie returned to his cell. The psychiatric evaluation continued for months. De la Horie's behavior never varied in a predictable pattern. Some days he would be catatonic, staring at walls for 18 hours without moving. Other days he exhibited manic energy, running in circles around his cell until he collapsed from exhaustion. He spoke occasionally, but only in incoherent fragments. One French-speaking medical orderly reported that De la Horie had spent an entire afternoon in animated conversation with someone who wasn't there, discussing the proper way to cultivate roses. When the orderly tried to join the conversation, De la Horie acted as if he didn't exist. The German medical staff documented every detail, and the file on De la Horie grew thicker than any other in the camp. Weber read psychology journals and consulted with colleagues by mail, but no one had encountered a case quite like this. Several experts suggested that even if De la Horie had begun by faking insanity, the prolonged isolation may have driven him genuinely mad. The human mind was not designed to sustain such extreme dissociation. Weber found this theory plausible but unprovable. After 15 months of observation, Weber tried prolonged isolation with no human contact. De la Horie was moved to a specially constructed cell with no windows and minimal light. Food was passed through a slot without verbal exchange. Guards were ordered not to speak to him or acknowledge his existence. Weber theorized that complete sensory deprivation might force him to drop the act or produce definitive symptoms of genuine psychosis. The isolation lasted 3 weeks. When guards finally opened the cell, they found De la Horie had used his own excrement to create an elaborate mural covering all 4 walls. The images depicted birds, trees, and what appeared to be a detailed map of an imaginary countryside. He sat in the center of the cell, naked and covered in filth, calmly eating insects he had caught in the darkness. The guards vomited. Weber examined the mural carefully. Despite its disgusting medium, the artwork showed genuine skill and internal consistency. The imaginary map had rivers, roads, and fortifications. Weber photographed the mural before ordering the cell cleaned, spending hours analyzing the photographs for hidden messages or patterns, but finding none. The mural appeared to be exactly what it seemed, the artistic expression of a completely deranged mind. By 18 months, Weber's initial certainty had completely dissolved. His reports to the commandant reflected his growing conviction that De la Horie's mental state was genuinely compromised. Other factors supported this assessment. De la Horie had lost nearly 40 pounds, his hair had gone partially grey, and his eyes had developed a permanent unfocused quality that Weber recognized from patients in civilian asylums. When Weber accidentally dropped a metal tray that created a loud crash inches from De la Horie's head, the Frenchman didn't flinch. When orderlies moved him, his body was completely limp, requiring 2 men to carry his dead weight. Such sustained muscular control seemed physiologically impossible for a malingerer. Weber began to suspect that attempting to expose De la Horie as a fraud might be medically dangerous. If the man had somehow driven himself into genuine psychosis through his deception, forcing him to confront reality might trigger a complete mental collapse or even suicide. Camp archives from this period paint a remarkable picture of medical and administrative frustration. Commandant Fisher wrote to regional headquarters for guidance, and higher command responded that prisoners certified as insane could be transferred to specialized facilities in Germany proper, removing them from the camp system. This possibility created new urgency. Weber convened a panel of 3 doctors to make a final determination. They spent 2 full days observing De La Horie and reviewing 18 months of documentation. Their unanimous conclusion, recorded in official medical records dated March 1918, stated that Lieutenant Jean de La Horie was suffering from a severe and apparently irreversible mental illness, origin unknown, prognosis poor. The panel noted that De La Horie posed no security risk, no longer recognized his own identity, and showed no awareness of the war or his prisoner status. They concluded his mind had completely disconnected from reality. They agreed unanimously that the condition was genuine. No sane man could sustain such a performance for so long under such intensive scrutiny. De La Horie had finally convinced them. The transfer papers were prepared within a week. Chapter 6. Against all odds. Finally, the German Medical Board convened. They reviewed the mountain of evidence, months of detailed observation reports, and the testimony of exasperated doctors. De La Horie was brought before them one last time. He stood there, vacant and dishevelled, occasionally letting out his coo-ee. Faced with what they could only conclude was a case of incurable dementia praecox, the board made its official recommendation. Lieutenant Jean-Pierre de La Horie was declared mentally unfit for military service and of no further use to the German Empire. He was approved for medical repatriation. He had won. Escorted by medics, the madman was placed on a train bound for neutral Switzerland. He had not tunnelled under the wire or cut through it. He had walked straight out of the front gate, his insanity serving as the ultimate forged document. But the train journey itself presented the ultimate test. De La Horie sat in the medical carriage, flanked by 2 German orderlies who believed they were escorting a hopeless lunatic. Every instinct screamed at him to drop the act, to sit up straight and watch his homeland draw closer with sane eyes. After 18 months of maintaining the fiction every waking hour, the temptation to be himself again was a physical pain. The orderlies spoke freely in front of him, discussing the war, their families, and their opinions of various officers. They treated him as furniture. One ate sausage directly in front of his face, the smell of real meat after months of camp rations almost breaking his composure. De La Horie kept his eyes unfocused. He drooled slightly. When one orderly waved a hand before his face to test his responsiveness, he didn't blink. The performance had to hold, not until Switzerland, not until the border was behind him and German authority had no claim. One slip, one witnessed moment of lucidity, and the train would turn around. The board's decision would be reversed, sending him back to the camp's punishment cells, this time stripped of his protective madness. The other prisoners who had helped him would also face consequences. Everything hung on these final hours. The physical strain of maintaining the act had worn him to nothing. His body, depleted by camp rations, had deteriorated under the self-imposed neglect required for authenticity. He had lost nearly 30 pounds. His muscles had atrophied from the shuffling, aimless wandering. The deliberately poor hygiene had caused real infections. Lice crawled through his hair and clothes. His gums bled from scurvy. The line between performance and reality had blurred in dangerous ways. Sometimes he was genuinely confused, his thoughts scattered after so long forcing them into disorder. He had trained his mind to malfunction so thoroughly that normal thinking required conscious effort. The madman's shuffle had become his natural gait, the vacant stare his default expression. He had lived the role so completely, he barely knew where Jean-Pierre de La Horie ended and the lunatic began. Now, sitting on this train, he needed to hold the fiction for perhaps 6 more hours. His entire being rebelled against it. The proximity of freedom made every second of pretense feel like holding his breath underwater. the surface visible but not yet reached. The train clattered through the German countryside. Through his peripheral vision, carefully maintaining his unfocused stare, De la Horie watched the landscape change. He saw towns with intact buildings and civilians going about ordinary lives, a stark contrast to the bombed-out ruins he had seen at his capture in 1916. Germany's interior remained functional, its war machine fed by the labor of places like this. The orderlies chatted about a recent Zeppelin raid on London, their voices carrying casual pride. De la Horie listened to every word, filing away details that Allied intelligence would want, but his face remained slack and his mouth hung slightly open. Saliva gathered at the corner of his lips. He let it. One orderly glanced at him with disgust, then returned to his newspaper. The train swayed. De la Horie swayed with it, loose and uncontrolled, like a bag of bones with no will of its own. His hands lay motionless, fingers occasionally twitching, not from a meaningless spasm, but from him fighting the urge to clench them in anticipation. Every mile closer to Switzerland increased the temptation to relax. At the Swiss border, the train slowed. De la Horie's heart hammered against his ribs so hard, he feared the orderlies would see his chest moving. This was the moment. German border officials boarded, moving through the carriages and checking papers to ensure no one unauthorized crossed into neutral territory. The medical carriage door opened. A border officer entered, his uniform crisp, his face bureaucratically stern. He looked at the orderlies, then at De la Horie. The orderlies produced their papers and the medical board's official documentation declaring this prisoner insane and approved for repatriation. The officer read the papers slowly, too slowly. He looked up at De la Horie, studying him. De la Horie stared past him at nothing, eyes tracking on some invisible point in the middle distance. His jaw hung slack. A thin line of drool connected his lip to his collar. The officer stepped closer. He leaned down, bringing his face directly into De la Horie's line of sight. He snapped his fingers sharply next to De la Horie's ear. No response. The officer straightened, said something to the orderlies about the shameful waste of a human mind, and stamped the papers. He left. The train lurched forward. The wheels began to turn. De la Horie felt the movement, but didn't let himself believe it. Not yet. Not until. The landscape subtly shifted in architecture and cultivation as they crossed onto Swiss rails. The train picked up speed, pulling away from the checkpoint. De la Horie counted the minutes post-checkpoint, recalling the maps he had memorized. 5, 10, 15. The orderlies relaxed, one lighting a cigarette, the other stretching his legs. They were in Switzerland now, their duty nearly complete. They spoke of being home by evening. De la Horie remained motionless, barely breathing, his entire consciousness focused on maintaining the act for just a few minutes more. The train began to slow. Through the window he saw the platform of a Swiss station approaching, marked with red crosses on white backgrounds. Orderlies in Swiss uniforms waited on the platform. The train hissed to a stop. The German orderlies stood, gathering their belongings. One moved to help De la Horie to his feet, gripping his arm. De la Horie rose slowly, moving with the vacant compliance of the genuinely insane, letting himself be led toward the door. His legs shook, but that could be attributed to his condition. His breathing came shallow and quick, but that too fit the profile. The door opened. Swiss air hit his face. The German orderlies transferred him and the paperwork to the waiting Swiss staff, saluted and reboarded their train. De la Horie stood on Swiss soil, surrounded by Swiss orderlies, watching the German train pull away. He waited. The Swiss orderlies began to lead him toward the medical building. He let them guide him, still shuffling, still vacant. They brought him into a clean, disinfected room. A Swiss doctor entered, reviewed the German paperwork, and examined De la Horie with professional detachment. He checked pupil response, reflexes, verbal acknowledgement. De la Horie gave him nothing. The doctor sighed, made notes, and instructed the orderlies to clean the patient and assign him a bed. They led him to a washroom. Only when the door closed and he stood alone before a mirror did de la Horie finally allow himself to see clearly. He looked at his reflection. A skeletal stranger stared back, hollow-eyed and ancient, aged decades beyond his 28 years. He gripped to the sink's edge, his hands shaking violently now that he allowed them to. He opened his mouth to speak. No sound came. His voice, unused for genuine communication in so long, had forgotten its function. He tried again, forcing air into words, not just sounds. A croak emerged, then words, barely whispered. French words, his own words. Je suis français. Je suis le lieutenant Jean-Pierre de la Horie. Je ne suis pas fou. I am French. I am Lieutenant Jean-Pierre de la Horie. I am not insane. He repeated it, louder. The Swiss orderly outside heard. The door opened. De la Horie turned, standing straight for the first time in 18 months, meeting the orderly's eyes with focused intelligence. He spoke clearly in French, his voice strengthening. He stated his name, rank, that he had just escaped German captivity by feigning insanity for 18 months and that he needed to contact French military authorities immediately. The Swiss medical staff moved quickly once they understood. Within hours, French liaison officers arrived, listening to de la Horie's account with growing astonishment. They verified his identity through military records and documented his story, the months of sustained performance that had fooled an entire camp and a panel of German military doctors. One officer, a major who had processed hundreds of repatriated prisoners, said he had never encountered anything like it. Escaped prisoners typically told stories of tunnels, bribed guards, and desperate runs through forests. None had simply convinced their captors to release them. None had weaponized their own apparent mental collapse. The intelligence value was significant. De la Horie provided detailed intelligence on Holzminden's layout, security, and guards, and described the German medical evaluation process that approved his repatriation. The French officers took extensive notes. A physical examination documented the cost, £32 lost, multiple vitamin deficiencies, muscle wastage, skin infections, and dental problems. Depression symptoms were also likely to emerge now that the stress of performance had ended. They recommended immediate medical care and psychiatric evaluation, not because they doubted his sanity, but because what he had done to himself had left marks that would need treatment. That first night, de la Horie lay in a clean bed, no longer performing under hostile eyes. He should have slept. His body desperately needed it. But his mind, released from its discipline, raced uncontrollably. Every sound made him flinch with the fear that German officials had come to take him back. He touched the bedsheets and walls to remind himself he was safe in Switzerland, but safety felt foreign and unfamiliar. After 18 months of constant vigilance, his nervous system didn't know how to exist without the performance. When sleep finally came in brief snatches, he dreamed he was still in Holzminden, shuffling through the compound, producing his meaningless cooey while guards watched. He woke in darkness, disoriented, his hands gripping the bed frame, slowly remembering Switzerland, free. The next morning, French officials began his transport arrangements, assuring him of honors for his escape. De la Horie listened with a disconnection he couldn't quite explain. Decorated for going mad, honored for losing himself so completely he wasn't sure how to be found again, but he nodded. He thanked them. He was going home. Chapter 7. The Legacy of the Weathercock upon crossing the border into Switzerland. The French officer, who had been a gibbering lunatic just hours before, calmly turned to his Swiss escorts. He straightened his uniform, an act of precision that stood in stark contrast to his recent behavior, looked them directly in the eye and in perfect rational French, requested a newspaper and a good meal. The Swiss officials were left speechless. The transformation was so complete, so instantaneous, that the stunned border guards filed a formal report documenting what they had witnessed. That report, preserved today in Swiss military archives, described Captain Charles de la Horie's sudden return to sanity as one of the most remarkable and unnerving performances they had encountered during the entire war. Within 48 hours, French military intelligence officers arrived in Bern, dispatched to debrief the newly repatriated captain. What they heard over the next 3 intense days would not only provide a wealth of tactical information, but would fundamentally reshape their understanding of psychological resistance. De la Hourie's debriefing lasted a grueling 72 hours. He provided astonishingly detailed intelligence on guard routines, the layouts of multiple prison camps, and German defensive positions visible from the fortress windows of Ingolstadt. But what interested the intelligence officers most was not the what, but the how, his methodology. He had documented every aspect of his 18-month performance in meticulous mental notes, what specific behaviors triggered transfers to less secure facilities, which doctors were most susceptible to manipulation, and critically, how long he could maintain the intense act before risking genuine psychological collapse. His debriefers, men accustomed to the straightforward narratives of soldiers, recognized immediately that they were looking at something unprecedented, a complete manual for psychological resistance, a new doctrine written not in theory, but through the crucible of lived experience. The French military, understanding its value, classified his entire debriefing secret and buried it deep within its intelligence files, where it would remain for 60 long years. De la Hourrie returned to a France celebrating victory in November 1918, just as the armistice was being signed. He was awarded the prestigious Légion d'honneur for his escape, though the official citation made no mention of his extraordinary methods. The award simply stated that he had escaped enemy captivity through exceptional ingenuity and determination. His family welcomed him home to Lyon, where he quietly resumed his pre-war legal practice. He married in 1920, had 2 daughters, and by all outward appearances became an ordinary, successful provincial attorney. But fellow prisoners who had survived the war and returned to France knew differently. Among this small fraternity, De la Hourie's name carried a unique weight. When they gathered at veterans' reunions, his story was told in hushed, reverent tones. The tale of the man who had beaten the Germans not with force, but with his mind, at their own game of psychological warfare. What the public never learned, and what his award citation ignored, was the terrible cost of his performance. De la Hourie's wife later confided in her daughters that their father suffered from what she simply called episodes. He would wake screaming, trapped in harrowing dreams where he could not remember who he was, where the act had become chillingly permanent. Sometimes he would catch himself in mirrors and not recognize his own face, a stranger staring back from the man he was supposed to be. The 18 months of performed insanity had carved deep, jagged grooves in his psyche that never fully smoothed with time. He never spoke publicly about his captivity or his methods. When asked, he would deflect, saying only that he had been fortunate. His daughters learned the full truth about the weathercock, the drooling, and the systematic degradation only after his death in 1953, when they found his private, locked journals in his study desk. Yet even as De la Hourrie maintained his public silence, his remarkable story began to fade from collective memory. The Great War produced so many tales of escape and resistance that no single story, regardless of its brilliance, could hold the public's attention for long. The British press celebrated their own escapers from German camps. The Americans lionized their Medal of Honor recipients. De la Hourie's feat, ingenious as it was, became a footnote in classified French military archives. By 1925, only a handful of former POWs still told his story at their reunions. By 1940, when France fell to Germany once again, and a new generation of soldiers faced captivity, De la Hourie's name and his unique method of resistance had been largely forgotten. His classified debriefing remained locked away, gathering dust in a Paris basement archive. The Second World War buried his story even deeper. New escapes, more daring, more deadly, and on a grander scale captured the public imagination. The mass breakout from Stalag Luft III, the intricate tunnel escapes from the infamous Colditz Castle, the brutal death marches, these became the dominant narratives that defined POW resistance in the cultural memory. By comparison, de la Hory's psychological warfare seemed almost quaint, a relic from a more civilized bygone era of captivity. Even among dedicated French resistance historians, his name rarely appeared. The few references that did exist treated his escape as a curiosity, an amusing anecdote of a mad officer, but nothing more significant. But the intelligence community never entirely forgot. In the aftermath of the Korean War, as American POWs returned with harrowing stories of communist brainwashing and sophisticated psychological torture, military researchers began a desperate search through archives for historical precedents. They were looking for examples of prisoners who had successfully resisted intense psychological pressure, who had managed to turn the tables on their captors. In 1957, during a classified NATO briefing on POW resistance strategies, a French liaison officer casually mentioned de la Hory's case. An American intelligence officer in the audience made a note. Within weeks, formal requests for the declassification of de la Hory's 1918 debriefing arrived at French military intelligence headquarters. The declassification process was slow, taking 3 years to complete. French authorities were understandably reluctant to release documents that detailed intelligence-gathering methods, even from a war 4 decades in the past. But in 1960, heavily redacted portions of de la Hory's debriefing finally entered the US military's classified research on POW resistance. The timing was critical. The Air Force was developing its survival, evasion, resistance, and escape SEER training for pilots who might be shot down over the Soviet Union or China. De la Hory's case offered something invaluable, a documented, sustained example of successful long-term deception of captors. The psychologists developing the nascent SEER curricula studied his methods with intense interest, the gradual escalation of symptoms, the use of strategic inconsistencies to confuse doctors, and the careful, constant observation of his captors' reactions. These became foundational teaching points, though the name de la Hory remained classified, a ghost in the machine of the new survival doctrine. The full story did not emerge into public view until 1987. A French historian named Marie-Claire Beaumont, researching a book on Great War POW camps, requested access to newly declassified intelligence files at the Service Historique de la Défense en Vincennes. She was looking for routine information on camp conditions and escape statistics. In Box 127, filed away among mundane reports and prisoner transfer orders, she found the complete, unredacted transcript of de la Hory's 1918 debriefing. She spent 6 hours reading it in the quiet archive reading room, captivated. When she finished, she immediately began a new search for his surviving family members. De la Hory's younger daughter, Marguerite, was still alive in 1988 when Beaumont contacted her. She was 83 years old, living in a retirement home in Nice. She agreed to meet with the historian, bringing with her the journals her father had never shown anyone. Over the course of several interviews, Marguerite provided the rich human context that the stark military debriefing had lacked. She described her father's nightmares, his silent dinners, the unsettling way he would sometimes seem to disappear inside himself, even while sitting at the family table. She gave Beaumont permission to publish excerpts from the journals on one condition, that the book make unequivocally clear this was not a simple story of triumph, but of survival at a tremendous and lasting personal cost. Beaumont's book, Les Évadés, French POW Escapes 1914 to 1918, appeared in 1991. Its most talked about chapter was titled The Madman of Ingolstadt. It was the first time the full story had ever been told publicly. French military historians took immediate notice. Within months, de la Hourie's case was being taught at the École Spéciale Militaire de Saint-Cyr as a masterclass in psychological resistance. The French Air Force, developing its own survival training program, incorporated elements of his methodology into modern instruction on resisting interrogation. His name, forgotten for 70 years, began appearing in military journals and historical studies. The story crossed the Atlantic in 1995 when an American SEER instructor researching historical escape cases came across a translation of Beaumont's book. He immediately recognized the parallels to techniques being taught at the Navy's SEER School in Brunswick, Maine. The principal de la Horie had discovered through sheer desperation that a systematic performance of instability could manipulate captors' perceptions and thereby reduce scrutiny was already being taught to naval aviators as a resistance technique, but the instructors had been teaching it without a firm historical precedent, as pure theory. Now, thanks to Beaumont's scholarship, they had a documented historical case. De la Hourie's story entered the Brunswick curriculum in 1996. Instructors used his case to illustrate a crucial lesson. Resistance is not always about overt defiance. Sometimes it is about appearing to break while maintaining absolute inner coherence. At the Air Force SEER School at Fairchild Air Force Base, his case became part of a broader module on long-term captivity resistance. The instructors emphasized specific aspects of his method, the 18-month timeline showing students that psychological resistance must be sustainable, the careful calibration of his performance, demonstrating the need to constantly monitor captors' reactions, and critically, the exit strategy, his methodical return to sanity that prevented future questions about whether he had genuinely recovered. These were not abstract principles, but concrete techniques derived from documented experience. The connection to modern doctrine went deeper. The U.S. Code of Conduct, Article 4 states, "If I become a prisoner of war, I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners. I will give no information or take part in any action which might be harmful to my comrades." De la Hourie's systematic intelligence gathering while feigning insanity became a classified case study in how prisoners could maintain resistance while appearing to comply. His method offered a template for maintaining military bearing and continuing the mission even in captivity. The doctrine did not cite him by name, but his influence was embedded in its interpretation. Today, de la Hourie's name appears in 3 places. At the Musée de la Résistance et de la Déportation in Lyon, a small exhibit includes his photograph and a brief description of his escape, alongside a replica of the weathercock he supposedly carried. His journals rest in the archives of the Service Historique de la Défense, available to researchers. And at SEER schools across the US military, instructors tell his story to students who may face captivity in places far more brutal than Ingolstadt ever was. They do not tell it as simple inspiration. They tell it as method. The lesson the military extracted is specific and unsentimental. Psychological resistance requires the same planning, discipline, and execution as a physical escape. His 18 months of performance were not spontaneous heroics, but a calculated operation. SEER instructors emphasized to students that his success depended on elements they can control: detailed observation of captors, a sustainable performance that does not risk actual psychological damage, and maintenance of a core identity beneath whatever mask circumstances require. These are teachable skills, not innate gifts. What makes de la Hourie's case endure in military training is not simply that he escaped, but precisely how he escaped. Physical escapes are common in military history. Most fail. Those that succeed often depend on luck or outside help. De la Hourie's escape depended solely on his profound understanding of human psychology and his ability to exploit it systematically. That makes it replicable in principle, a methodology to be studied if not perfectly duplicated. It offers prisoners a different kind of resistance, not of the tunnel or the wire, but of the performed self. His legacy is not in monuments. No streets bear his name. The weathercock disappeared sometime in the 1920s. His grave in Lyon is marked with a simple stone. What endures is more practical. His case file, his methods, his documented proof that the mind can be both weapon and shield. In the curriculum documents that guide survival training, De la Horie exists not as a symbol, but as a data point. He showed that it could be done. That is his legacy. Not heroism, but technique. The strongest prison, he proved, is still run by humans, and humans can be fooled by someone willing to pay the price. He paid it. The nightmares, the episodes, the years of silent dinners, that was the price of his return. But he walked out when others did not. The military remembers that arithmetic, that cold calculus of survival.